Welcome to Bharati 100, a podcast dedicated to exploring the life and legacy of Indian national poet C. Subramania Bharati, who died 100 years ago. This is Meera T. Sundararajan, Bharati's great-granddaughter. In this episode, I'd like to talk about an article that Bharati published in 1916 called Reflections. It's a very interesting article to read in the light of current happenings for us, especially current literary events. I'm talking about the award of the Nobel Prize in Literature for 2021, which was announced just about a couple of weeks ago now, and it went to a writer and professor named Abdulrazak Gurnah. Professor Gurnah originally comes from the Sultanate of Zanzibar. That's where he was born. He's in his 70s now, and Zanzibar is currently part of present-day Tanzania. Professor Gurnah was a very interesting choice for the Nobel Committee. He is a writer who left his home region of East Africa when he was about 18 years old and came to settle in Britain, in the heartland of what had been colonial government in his part of the world. And apparently he began writing in order to try to make sense of his experiences as a person coming from where he did and living the life that he did, in many ways the life of a displaced person, dealing with the ongoing consequences of colonialism. Professor Gurnah's first language was actually Swahili, but he made a choice to write literature in the English language. His Nobel citation states that he was awarded the prize for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee. Perhaps the citation sounds a little bit unusual in terms of the language choices in English, but there is a long description of Professor Gurnah's work on the website of the Nobel Prize, which is absolutely striking, and I just wanted to read a few words from that, where the committee describes one of Professor Gurnah's earlier works, and they talk about his own youth in Zanzibar, where for centuries a number of different languages, cultures, and religions have existed side by side, but also fought each other for hegemony. Even if his novels are written in an intriguing alliance with an Anglo-Saxon tradition, the cosmopolitan backdrop provides their distinctiveness. Dialogue and the spoken word play an important role, with noticeable elements of Swahili, Arabic, Hindi, and German. I find it tremendously exciting that the Nobel Committee has chosen to focus this year on a writer whose primary preoccupation is colonialism, and in particular, the ongoing effects of colonialism in the post-colonial era. This recognition really underscores my belief that the timing couldn't possibly be better for Subramania Bharati's English writings to be published as well, because the themes and concerns are fundamentally so similar. The award of the Nobel is clearly a wonderful opportunity to draw attention to the works of a particular writer, to the region where that writer comes from, to the culture represented by the writer, and of course to the themes that the writer has thought it important to address in the course of a lifetime of work. But the Nobel in literature has always been controversial, and in fact in recent years it has become more controversial than ever, with the selection committee facing various scandals and so on. it's interesting to notice that the list of writers who never received a Nobel Prize is also an eminent group, and in fact, you might say that it is just as eminent as those who actually did receive this recognition. I'm thinking, for example, of Tolstoy, who was nominated for the first Nobel Prize in Literature in 1901 but never received it. And as another example, Thomas Hardy, who was nominated multiple times and also failed to be awarded the prize. One of Hardy's nominations was actually in 1913, and in that year, the prize went to an Indian writer, Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore was a writer of unparalleled importance for Bengali speakers, and when he received the award in 1913, it was a very, very big deal for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the first time that a non-European had been awarded a Nobel Prize. And then it's very interesting to consider how the award of the prize developed as well, because Tagore was very much unlike Subramania Bharati in his personal circumstances. He came from a very wealthy and influential family in Bengal and traveled all over the world. During his travels in Europe, he met a number of important writers and cultural figures, among them William Butler Yeats, who took a great interest in Tagore and in his work. At that time, Tagore had translated an important collection of poetry called Gitanjali into English. And as I understand it, this translation was extensively reviewed by Yeats. It eventually became the basis for the award of the Nobel Prize in Literature to Tagore, which cited Gitanjali and made the fascinating comment that through this particular work, Tagore had brought Indian literature into the consciousness of the West. People often ask questions about Subramania Bharati and the Nobel Prize. In fact, when I was growing up, I heard it said on more than one occasion that Bharati had often been considered as a candidate for the prize. Perhaps in India, he was never formally nominated. But I think the question of why Tagore was a good candidate, whereas Bharati wasn't really given the opportunity to be considered for the prize, is sort of a moot question. Looking at the history of what happened to Tagore and how he ended up becoming an awardee, clearly this had to do with the importance of Tagore's work, but also a number of other fortuitous circumstances had to come together to bring that work to the attention of people in the West and ultimately to the attention of the Nobel Committee itself. So it seems fairly obvious in the circumstances in which Bharati was living, the fact that he was fleeing from the British and living in exile in Pondicherry under French government, and really had no resources to make his voice heard outside Indian borders, pretty much eliminated any possibility that he could be seriously considered for something like the Nobel. I also think that at some level it ultimately doesn't matter that much, because the important thing is that Bharati's work has survived. People continue to read it, and his reputation has developed accordingly. In not being awarded the prize, he has joined that very illustrious company of writers who have perhaps changed literature, language, human thought, and even human history without necessarily finding their way onto the Nobel list. What's fascinating to contemplate is the relationship between the two men. Now, they never met, but Bharati knew Tagore's work and admired him immensely. He also felt that the recognition gained by Tagore outside India was something incredibly important for the country. In the article called Reflections, Bharati writes about this in a particular context, that of Tagore's visit to Japan. I think that in Japan, there is a deep appreciation of Indian culture as a sort of root or mother culture for Japanese culture in many respects. I remember lecturing in Japan as a law professor, speaking, as a matter of fact, about the history of Indian law, with a simultaneous translator translating my remarks from the English language into Japanese. During my talk, I had to make reference to Sanskrit terms arising in the history of Indian law, and at those moments I saw heads nodding in the audience. Words like dharma, Sanskrit words, were recognized by Japanese people as part of their own heritage. To me, it was a very moving and humbling experience to realize that there is an incredible richness of Pan-Asian culture with deep roots in India. So when I read what Bharati wrote about Tagore's reception in Japan, it doesn't surprise me at all. Bharati asks, "Does it happen every day that an Indian goes to Japan and there receives the highest honor from all classes of people, from Prime Minister Okuma as well as from the simple monk of the Buddhist shrine?" But Bharati is concerned about Tagore's Japanese trip for two reasons. First of all, he upbraids the Indian press for not paying enough attention to it. And he wants them to do just that for a second reason, because he feels it's imperative that people in India should know about the greatness of what their fellow Indians are doing. And in this regard, Bharati's thinking is so interesting. He feels that greatness is there for his countryfolk to touch, and that they will be inspired to do so by becoming aware of the outstanding achievements of the people around them. Here's what he writes. He says, "The Indian press does not appear to be doing full justice to the activities of Rabindranath Tagore in Japan. We must spread the contagion of greatness among the people. To this end, the whole country must be made aware of the important doings and sayings of representative Indians. And who can do this more effectively than the great journalists of modern India?" And, as so often happens, Bharati raises the level of his discourse here. He moves from a nationalist discussion to a universalist perspective. He talks about one of the subjects that most fascinated him, the nature of human genius. And he writes, "It is genius that elevates the race of men. The Indian ear must ring with the fame of Indian genius. The present intellectual and spiritual revival in the country will be regarded by coming generations as one of the most brilliant chapters in human history." What I find truly inspiring about Bharati's vision is its democratic quality, the accessibility of genius in his mind. He writes, "An individual poet is merely a symbol. We shall soon have scores and scores of them, men of thought and men of deed. Go watch thyself or watch thy brother, either of you will soon be great." This seems to me to be such an interesting perspective today, when so many of us, particularly in the West, tend to think of genius as a phenomenon of the past, and of great human geniuses, be they men or sometimes women, as people who were working decades or perhaps centuries ago. If Bharati were here today, he would probably warn us about the dangers of such a perspective. He would surely exhort our journalists and publicists, just as he did those of his day in India, to find the people in the world who are doing great work and to make that work known to the public. To him, the future of the country was deeply bound to the recognition of genius. It's a perspective that continues to resonate, I think, for India and for the world 100 years later.